I didn't know it yet, but the most surreal night of my life had already begun when we walked into the grand reception hall. The air was thick with the aroma of fresh roses and expensive perfume. Everyone was smiling, talking, and clinking glasses of champagne in celebration. My husband, Daniel, stood beside me, impeccably dressed, his dark suit tailored to perfection. He looked at me and gave a familiar grin, the one that had made me fall in love with him years ago. The wedding belonged to Jessica, one of my closest friends since college, and her fiancé, Eric, whom she described as her soulmate. Jessica looked radiant in her lacy white gown, her smile lighting up the room. We exchanged warm hugs and a few laughs before the festivities pulled her away. The evening seemed perfect, at least on the surface. Daniel was unusually attentive, making sure my glass was always full and pulling me close for occasional whispers of sweet nothings. At one point, we danced, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have him, this man who still looked at me like I was the only woman in the room. But then there were cracks. His phone buzzed more than usual, and each time, his easy smile would falter just enough to raise a quiet alarm in the back of my mind. When I asked who it was, he waved it off casually, saying it was a coworker and not important. I didn't press further. I wanted to enjoy the evening, not dissect every subtle change in his demeanor. The ceremony shifted into high gear as the band started playing, and guests filled the dance floor. The mood was electric. Laughter bubbled from every corner of the room, and glasses clinked endlessly with toasts to Jessica and Eric's happiness. For a while, I let myself sink into the joyful chaos, chatting with old friends, stealing bites from the decadent dessert table, and reveling in the infectious energy. Daniel drifted in and out of sight, but I didn't think much of it. He wasn't the clingy type, and big events like this often overwhelmed him. When I caught glimpses of him, he was mingling with Eric's friends or nursing a glass of whiskey by the bar. I chalked it up to him needing his space and reminded myself that we were here to celebrate someone else's love story. But then, Jessica's absence caught my attention. It was subtle at first. She hadn't been on the dance floor for a while, which seemed odd for a bride. I shrugged it off, assuming she was busy with family or taking a moment to compose herself. Weddings can be overwhelming. But when an hour passed and she still hadn't returned, a gnawing unease took root. "Have you seen Jess?" I asked one of the bridesmaids, a bubbly woman named Katie, who seemed equally perplexed. "No, actually," Katie replied, scanning the room. "Maybe she's with Eric?" I nodded, though the explanation didn't satisfy me. Eric was right where I'd seen him last, surrounded by groomsmen, laughing and sharing stories. He looked completely at ease, too at ease for a man whose new bride was unaccounted for. Something was off. I decided to take a quick walk around the venue. Jessica might have stepped away for a breather, perhaps to the bridal suite. On my way out of the reception hall, I passed Daniel. He was at the bar again, leaning slightly closer than necessary to a tall, slender woman I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. "Have you seen Jess?" I asked him casually, trying to keep my voice light. He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "No, I haven't. I'm sure she's fine. Maybe she needed a break." I nodded and smiled, but the knot in my chest only grew tighter as I walked away. The halls outside the reception buzzed with activity. Caterers bustled past with trays of half-eaten dishes, and staff members hurried about, resetting tables and fluffing floral arrangements. Everything was meticulously curated, but the energy felt hollow, as if something unseen was unraveling behind the scenes. I made my way to the bridal suite, my heels clicking on the polished marble floors. The suite was tucked away at the end of a quiet hallway, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated, a cold prickle running down my spine. "Jess?" I called softly, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a nearby vanity. Jessica's veil lay crumpled on the floor, stark white against the plush carpet. Her bouquet sat abandoned on the chaise lounge, its delicate petals starting to wilt. "Jessica?" I stepped inside, my voice trembling. The air smelled faintly of her floral perfume, but the room was otherwise silent. A wave of unease washed over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Perhaps she'd just stepped out for some air and left in a hurry. I turned to leave, but a muffled sound stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of voices. At first, I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but as I stood still, listening intently, I realized it was drifting in from behind another door. It led to a smaller, adjoining room, likely used as a private dressing area. The voices grew clearer as I approached, and my blood ran cold when I recognized one of them. Daniel. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. He was laughing softly, his tone low and intimate. The response that followed was unmistakably Jessica's. My heart plummeted, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe he'd found her upset and was comforting her. Maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. But deep down, I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open. And there they were. Jessica's back was pressed against the wall, her wedding dress pushed up to her thighs. Daniel's hands were on her waist, his lips brushing her neck. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer as if she couldn't bear the distance between them. The world tilted beneath me. What the hell? The words escaped before I could stop them, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They sprang apart, their faces contorted in matching expressions of horror. Jessica's cheeks flushed crimson, her hands flying up to smooth her dress. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between me and Jessica as if scrambling for an explanation. Sophie, he began, his voice too calm, too measured. It's not what it looks like. I stared at him, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears. Not what it looks like. Then explain it, Daniel. Explain why my husband is pressed up against my best friend on her wedding day. Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked as though she wanted to disappear, her gaze fixed on the floor. You, I turned to her, my voice breaking. How could you? On your wedding day, Jessica? With my husband? Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer. The silence was deafening, a sickening confirmation of everything I didn't want to believe. The room felt impossibly small, suffocating me with the weight of betrayal. I waited, clinging to some futile hope that one of them would break the silence and offer a shred of explanation that could make this nightmare disappear. But they didn't. Jessica sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling as she clutched her face. Daniel stood frozen, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. I could see the gears turning in his mind, as if he was calculating how much of the truth to admit. Say something. I shouted, my voice cracking. Sophie, please, Daniel finally said, his tone infuriatingly placating. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that didn't even feel like it came from me. Didn't mean anything? You're standing here, half undressed with the bride on her wedding day, and you want me to believe it didn't mean anything? It's not what you think. Stop lying. I snapped, cutting him off. My hands were shaking so badly that I balled them into fists at my sides. I saw you, Daniel. I heard you. And you, I turned to Jessica, who flinched at the venom in my voice. You were supposed to be my best friend. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't soften my fury. Sophie, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what came over me. What came over you? I repeated, incredulous. How about your vows? Or the man waiting for you in the other room who thinks you're the love of his life? Jessica buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the way she had looked at Daniel, the way her hands had gripped his shirt like she couldn't bear to let him go. This wasn't the first time, was it? I asked, my voice eerily calm now. Neither of them answered. Answer me. I screamed, the sound tearing through the small room like a thunderclap. Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. Jessica shook her head frantically, but the guilt on her face betrayed her. How long? My voice wavered, the anger giving way to despair. How long have you two been sneaking around behind my back? Daniel hesitated, and in that moment, I felt the final thread of my composure snap. 3 months, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 months. The weight of it crashed over me, stealing the air from my lungs. 3 months of lies. 3 months of him smiling at me, holding me, pretending to be the man I thought he was, all while carrying on an affair with my best friend. I turned to leave, needing to get away from the stifling air, their faces, the unbearable reality of what I'd just witnessed. But as I reached the door, I paused. You've destroyed everything, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I hope it was worth it. I walked out of the room, my heels clicking loudly against the marble floors as I tried to hold myself together. The hallway was deserted, but the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifted from the reception, mocking me with their oblivious joy. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding in my ears. Sophie, wait. Daniel's voice echoed behind me. I didn't stop. I couldn't. He caught up to me just as I reached the grand staircase leading back to the reception hall. His hand wrapped around my arm, firm but desperate. Please, just let me explain, he pleaded. I yanked my arm free, turning to face him. Explain what, Daniel? That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been sleeping with my best friend? His face contorted with guilt. I never meant for you to find out like this. I swear, Find out? I cut him off, my voice rising. So it would have been fine as long as I didn't know? Is that what you're saying? He ran a hand through his hair, his composure unraveling. No. That's not what I meant. It was a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake. I stared at him, my chest heaving. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Daniel. This is a choice. Over and over again, you chose her. His silence was damning. I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. Do you even love me? The question came out as a whisper, but it felt like it echoed through the cavernous hall. His lips parted, but no answer came. His hesitation was all I needed. Unbelievable, I muttered, my voice cracking. You can't even say yes. I turned and started down the stairs, gripping the railing to steady myself. My vision blurred with tears, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't break here, not in front of him. Sophie, don't do this, he called after me. I stopped halfway down the staircase and looked back at him, my voice cold. Don't do what? Walk away? What did you think would happen, Daniel? That I'd just smile and pretend nothing happened? That I'd stand by your side after this? I didn't mean to hurt you, he said weakly, his voice barely audible. But you did, I replied. And now, you get to live with that. The laughter and music grew louder as I entered the reception hall, my face a mask of calm despite the storm raging inside me. My eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Eric. He deserved to know what was happening on his wedding day, even if it would shatter him. I found him by the dance floor, his face glowing with happiness as he clinked glasses with his groomsmen. The sight made my stomach twist. How could Jessica do this to him? I approached slowly, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. Eric, I said softly, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his smile faltering when he saw my face. Sophie? Is everything okay? No, I said, barely managing to keep my voice steady. It's not. Eric's brows furrowed as he studied my face, concern flickering in his eyes. What's wrong, Sophie? You're scaring me. My lips parted, but the words refused to come. How do you tell someone their world is about to collapse? That the person they've pledged their life to has betrayed them in the worst way imaginable? Sophie? Eric prompted, his voice firmer now. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "We need to talk," I said, glancing around at the other groomsmen. "Privately." Eric nodded, his expression now a mask of worry. He followed me to a quiet corner near the edge of the room, away from the noise and the oblivious joy of the reception. "What's going on?" he asked. "Is it Jessica? Is she okay?" I bit my lip, tears welling in my eyes again. "Eric, I don't know how to say this, but you need to know the truth." He took a step closer, his jaw tightening. "The truth about what?" I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop, to protect him from the pain I was about to inflict. But he deserved the truth. He deserved better than the lies that had been woven around him. I found Jessica," I began, my voice trembling. "She was, with Daniel." Eric blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "What do you mean, with Daniel?" I took a shaky breath, steeling myself. I walked into the bridal suite. They were together, Eric. In a way they shouldn't have been. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if trying to process the words. Then his face twisted in disbelief. No, that's not possible." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're lying," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "Jessica would never, she wouldn't do that to me." "I saw them, Eric," I said, my tears spilling over now. "I heard them." His face crumpled, and he staggered back, leaning against the wall for support. The color drained from his cheeks as the weight of my words settled on him. She promised me," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "She said I was the only one. The only one." I reached out to him, but he pulled away, his breathing ragged. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Eric, wait. Where is she, Sophie?" he shouted, drawing the attention of nearby guests. I hesitated, unsure if I should tell him. But he stormed off before I could answer, pushing past the crowd with wild determination. I followed, my heart pounding. I couldn't let him confront them alone, not like this. The scene that unfolded was chaos. Eric burst into the bridal suite, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Jessica," he roared. She flinched at the sight of him, her tear-streaked face going pale. "Eric, Don't," he bellowed, his hands trembling at his sides. "Don't you dare try to explain this." Daniel, standing a few feet away, stepped forward. "Eric, listen." "Shut up." Eric snapped, his voice filled with venom. "You don't get to speak. Neither of you do." Jessica dissolved into sobs, clutching at Eric's arm. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Eric shouted, yanking his arm free. "That you're a liar? A cheater? That you threw away everything we had for this?" He gestured furiously at Daniel, who stood frozen, guilt etched across his face. The tension in the room was unbearable. Jessica dropped to her knees, her dress pooling around her as she cried. Daniel looked at me, his expression pleading, but I turned away. Eric's voice broke as he whispered, "Was any of it real, Jess? Did you even love me?" She sobbed harder, unable to answer. And with that, something inside Eric seemed to shatter. He turned and walked out, leaving Jessica crumpled on the floor and Daniel staring after him. Eric's retreat left a deafening silence in his wake, broken only by Jessica's sobs. I stood frozen near the door, my mind spinning. Daniel took a hesitant step toward me, his face pale, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't," I warned, my voice trembling. "Don't say anything." He hesitated, his lips parting as if to argue, but the fury in my eyes must have silenced him. Without another word, I turned and followed Eric. I found him outside, standing near a decorative fountain in the courtyard. The crisp night air bit at my skin, but Eric didn't seem to notice the cold. He stared blankly at the rippling water, his hands braced on the stone edge of the fountain. "Eric," I said softly, approaching him cautiously. He didn't turn around. I don't know what to do, he murmured, his voice hollow. I stood beside him, unsure of what to say. What could anyone say to make this better? She was my everything, he continued, his voice cracking. I thought I knew her. I thought, he trailed off, shaking his head. I'm so sorry, I whispered, my heart breaking for him. He let out a bitter laugh. Don't apologize, Sophie. This isn't your fault. It's theirs. We stood in silence for a long moment, the cool breeze carrying faint strains of music from the reception. Finally, he straightened and turned to me, his expression hardening. They can't get away with this, he said, his jaw tightening. I nodded, understanding the resolve in his voice. What do you want to do? Eric's eyes darkened. I'm ending this. Right here, right now. Back inside the venue, the reception continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the background. Jessica and Daniel hadn't returned to the main hall, which left most of the guests happily unaware of the storm brewing. Eric strode into the room with purpose, his shoulders squared. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding as I realized what he intended to do. He climbed onto the small stage where the band had been playing, grabbing a microphone. The room fell silent, heads turning in curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric began, his voice carrying through the hall. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion flickering across their faces. But unfortunately, Eric continued, his tone sharp, it seems this day will be memorable for all the wrong reasons. I watched as Jessica entered the hall from a side door, her face pale. She froze when she saw Eric on the stage, her eyes widening in panic. Eric spotted her immediately. Ah, there she is. My beautiful bride, he said bitterly. Or should I say, the woman who just spent the last hour with someone else's husband. Gasps erupted around the room. Jessica's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she shook her head. Eric, please, she started, stepping forward. Don't you dare, he snapped, his voice cutting through her plea. You don't get to play the victim here, Jess. The guests looked around in shock, whispers spreading like wildfire. Daniel appeared next, lingering at the edge of the room, his face a mask of dread. And as for you, Eric said, pointing directly at Daniel. You were supposed to be my friend. The tension in the room was unbearable. Let this be a lesson to everyone here, Eric said, addressing the crowd. Trust is fragile. And some people aren't worth it. With that, he dropped the microphone, the sharp feedback ringing out as it hit the stage. The room erupted into chaos, gasps, murmurs, and hushed conversations filling the air. Jessica broke down, sobbing openly as her parents rushed to her side. Daniel stood frozen, the weight of everyone's stares bearing down on him. I didn't wait for the aftermath. I slipped out quietly, the weight of the night crashing down on me. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The echoes of Eric's speech still rang in my ears, a bitter symphony of betrayal and humiliation. I should have felt vindicated seeing Jessica and Daniel exposed for what they'd done, but instead, I felt empty. When I reached our house, I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. This was where our life together had unfolded, the late-night conversations, the shared dreams, the quiet mornings over coffee. And now it felt tainted, like every memory had been retroactively poisoned. I stepped inside and was immediately overwhelmed by the silence. Normally, Daniel's presence would fill the space, even if it was just the sound of his footsteps or the hum of the television. But tonight, the house felt cold, foreign. I went to the bedroom, avoiding the framed photos on the walls. One in particular caught my eye as I passed, a picture of Daniel and me on our anniversary last year. We'd looked so happy, so in love. It was hard to reconcile that image with the man I'd confronted tonight. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed. Instead, I grabbed a blanket from the couch and curled up in the living room, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door opening. Daniel walked in, his face haggard and drawn. "Sophie," he began, his voice soft. I sat up, clutching the blanket around me like armor. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," he said cautiously, as though testing the waters. "Not anymore," I said firmly, standing to face him. "After last night, I think it's pretty clear you've made your choices." "Sophie, please," he said, stepping closer. "I know I messed up, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." "Love me?" I repeated, my voice rising. "If you loved me, Daniel, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me for months while sneaking around with Jessica." He looked down, guilt flashing across his face. "It didn't mean anything," he muttered. "That's what you keep saying," I said bitterly. "Do you think that makes it better? That somehow it doesn't count if it didn't mean anything?" "I was stupid," he admitted. "I got caught up in something I shouldn't have. But it's over now." I stared at him, incredulous. "Over? Do you think this all just goes away because you've decided it's over? That I can just forget what I saw?" His silence was answer enough. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I need you to leave, Daniel." "Sophie, come on," he protested. "No," I said firmly, my voice shaking. "I deserve better than this. You don't get to destroy everything and then pretend like we can just go back to the way things were." For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, but then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll pack some things," he said quietly. Watching him gather his belongings was surreal. He moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding my gaze as he stuffed clothes into a duffel bag. When he was done, he lingered by the door, as though he expected me to stop him. But I didn't. "I'll call you," he said, his voice tentative. I didn't respond. He hesitated, then stepped out into the morning light, closing the door softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, I sank onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. I had stood my ground, but the pain of it all was unbearable. The days that followed felt like trudging through quicksand. I moved through my routines mechanically, brushing my teeth, pouring cereal into a bowl, answering emails for work. But every moment was haunted by the echoes of what had happened: Daniel's betrayal, Jessica's tears, Eric's anguish. Word of the wedding fiasco spread quickly. Jessica and Eric's relationship was over. There was no salvaging it after what Eric had exposed in front of their family and friends. Jessica tried reaching out to me once, sending a long, rambling message apologizing for what she'd done and begging for forgiveness. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Forgiveness felt like an impossibility. Daniel texted me a few times, his messages alternating between heartfelt apologies and desperate pleas to talk. Each one made my heart ache, but I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to face him, let alone listen to his excuses. Instead, I threw myself into cleaning the house, scrubbing every surface as though I could erase the memories of him. I packed away the photos of us, the little mementos of our life together. Each item I touched felt like peeling off another layer of my soul, leaving me raw and exposed. One afternoon, as I boxed up the last of his things, I found a small notebook tucked away in his bedside table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were pages of notes, dreams we'd shared, plans for the future, things he loved about me. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. It was a painful reminder of what we'd once had, and what we'd lost. I wanted to hate him, to erase him from my life completely. But part of me still clung to the man I thought I knew, the man who had written those words. A week after Daniel left, Eric called me. "Hey," he said softly when I answered. "Hey," I replied, surprised to hear from him. I wanted to check on you," he said. "After everything." I smiled faintly, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I should be the one checking on you," I said. Eric laughed bitterly. "I'm surviving." "Barely." We talked for a while, sharing the pain and confusion that had consumed our lives since that night. There was a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't alone, that someone else understood what I was going through. "Do you think it ever gets easier?" I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper. "I hope so," he said. "Because right now, it feels like I'll never be whole again." In the weeks that followed, Eric and I spoke more often. What began as occasional check-ins turned into longer conversations, sometimes lasting hours. We talked about everything: the betrayal, our failed relationships, our fears for the future. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. But having someone who understood made the burden feel a little lighter. One evening, Eric suggested a meeting for coffee. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to face him in person after everything we'd been through. But something inside me whispered that it was the right step forward. When I walked into the small cafe, Eric was already there, sitting by the window. He looked tired, but he smiled when he saw me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. As I approached Eric's table, my heart raced. It wasn't nerves, exactly, it was something deeper, a feeling that this moment was a turning point, even if I couldn't quite grasp how or why. He stood when I reached him, offering a small, genuine smile. "Hey," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. For a moment, we sat in silence, the hum of the cafe wrapping around us like a cocoon. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt like we were both taking a moment to steady ourselves before diving into the uncharted waters of whatever this was. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eric admitted, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Neither was I said honestly." His smile faltered, but he nodded. "I get it. After everything, it's hard to know what's real anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "That's exactly it." We talked for hours, our coffee growing cold as we peeled back the layers of our shared pain. He told me how he'd packed up his things and moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Jessica, how he'd returned the wedding gifts unopened. "It's strange," he said, staring down at his hands. "I loved her so much. But now, when I think about her, all I feel is emptiness." I reached across the table, my fingers brushing his. "It's not your fault, Eric. You gave her everything. She's the one who threw it away." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between us. A shared understanding. A flicker of something fragile but undeniable. Over the next few months, Eric and I found ourselves leaning on each other more and more. We weren't rushing into anything, neither of us was ready for that. But we'd found a lifeline in each other, a safe harbor in the storm. We went for long walks, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes we laughed, sometimes we cried, but each moment felt like a step toward healing. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Eric turned to me. "You know," he said, his voice hesitant, "I never thought I'd be able to trust anyone again after Jessica." I looked at him, my heart aching for the pain he'd endured. "Me neither," I admitted. "But with you," he continued, his voice soft, "it feels different. Like maybe we can help each other put the pieces back together." I didn't know what to say. My chest tightened, and tears welled in my eyes. But I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Maybe we can," I whispered. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and complicated and full of scars. But in the aftermath of betrayal, Eric and I had found something unexpected: hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, I believed in the possibility of happiness again. And that was enough to start over.